You wake up, check your phone, feel behind. Again, there's a voice in your head whispering, "You're not doing enough. You should be further by now." You look around, and it feels like everyone is racing ahead. Some are landing big jobs. Some are building businesses. Some are going viral doing nothing. And then there's you, stuck between what you should do and what you actually want to do. You went to school like they told you. You tried being practical. But something feels off, like you're living a version of success that isn't really yours. It gets lonely, confusing, loud, and maybe you're not even sure if you're living right anymore. And maybe you've never stopped to ask, am I living a life I chose, or just one that other people clap for? Because truth is, most of us aren't lacking motivation. We're just spending it running in the wrong direction. The real question might not be how hard you're working, but what kind of game you're even playing. There was a guy I used to know. We'll call him Matt. He was one of those people who always seemed to be chasing something new. Fresh out of college, he landed a decent job at a startup, quit after 3 months. "It's not challenging enough," he said. Then he tried dropshipping, gave up in 6 weeks. Then crypto, then trading, then YouTube. Each time it was the same story. High energy at the start, frustration when results didn't come fast, and then on to the next thing. At some point, I stopped trying to keep up with what Matt was doing. Until one day, I ran into him at a coffee shop I hadn't been to in years. He looked tired, worn out. Not physically, but soul tired. We sat down, talked, and he told me something I'll never forget. "I don't even know what I'm building anymore. I feel like I'm constantly trying to win." It hit me he wasn't failing. He was just choosing the wrong life again and again. Not because he didn't care, but because he never stopped to ask what he truly cared about. He wasn't really playing a game that mattered to him. He was playing to be seen, to win fast, to avoid feeling behind. And the people around him? They weren't building anything long-term either. They were all sprinting. No finish line in sight, just more running. There's a quote by Naval Ravikant that stopped me in my tracks when I first heard it. "Play long-term games with long-term people." It's simple, almost too simple, but it hits different when you're in Matt's shoes burnt out, not from working too hard, but from chasing without anchoring. So what is a long-term game? It's not just staying at a job for years. It's committing to a process that compounds. It's writing even when no one's reading, learning when there's no exam, showing up when there's no applause. Long-term games aren't always glamorous, but they build something real inside and out. And long-term people? They're the ones who value growth over hype, depth over drama, people who can sit with uncertainty and still stay. Because short-term people will leave the moment it stops being exciting. But long-term people stay when it gets hard. They understand that greatness takes time, and they're not in a rush. Matt never had a long-term game. And honestly, most of us don't. Not because we're lazy, but because we're overwhelmed. We think success means being everywhere, trying everything. But maybe true success is doing fewer things deeper, longer, with better people. Because you can't build a life that lasts by playing games designed to burn you out. But let me be clear, this quote isn't a blanket rule. If you're in a phase of life where you're exploring, trying to figure out what fits, it's okay to switch gears. You're not wrong for walking away from something that drains you. But the moment you find something that aligns with your values, that's when you stop hopping. That's when you dig in. And here's the twist. Choosing your game is only half the battle. The other half choosing who you play it with. Because even the best long-term vision can collapse if the people around you are only playing for today. I remember another friend, Sarah. She wasn't flashy, she didn't talk big, but she spent 5 years building a tiny nonprofit from her living room. Most people didn't get it. No scale, no exit plan. But now, that nonprofit has impacted thousands of families. She didn't play loud. She played long. And she surrounded herself with people who believed in the mission even when it wasn't sexy. People who showed up without needing to be seen. There's a quiet kind of power in the long game. It doesn't look like hustle. It looks like patience. It looks like consistency when no one's watching. It's the kind of power that doesn't need to prove anything because it's not afraid of time. And maybe that's the shift we all need. Not to chase faster wins, but to choose better games. To stop measuring success by how quick it comes and start measuring it by how true it feels. But what if your environment, the people you're closest to, don't see things that way? What if you're ready to play long term, but the 5 people you're with are just killing time? You've probably heard it before, but you might not have felt its full weight. You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. A quote by Jim Rohn that sounds almost too simple until it starts explaining things you never had words for. Like why you used to dream big. But now, everything feels muted. Why you stopped challenging yourself. Why you can't tell if you've changed or just adjusted to fit in. I once knew a girl named Rachel. She moved across the country for a fresh start, new job, new city, new apartment. She found a cheap place to rent with 4 other people around her age. Seemed perfect at first. They were fun. Always up for a night out. Always had something to laugh about. Rachel felt included, wanted, and after months of loneliness, that meant everything. But slowly, things shifted. She stopped journaling. She hadn't read a book in months. She said yes to things she used to question. It wasn't obvious at first, but the decline was steady, like rust. When she visited her old friend group, they noticed it immediately. "You feel different," one of them said. And Rachel, for the first time, wondered, what if the problem isn't what I'm doing, but who I'm doing it around? We like to think we're independent, that we think for ourselves. But the truth is, proximity shapes perspective. The people closest to us, in voice, in vibe, in values, quietly sculpt who we become. Not through force, just frequency. If the people around you normalize shortcuts, gossip, or low standards, you eventually stop noticing. Not because you agree, but because you adapt. And it works the other way too. Spend time around someone who thinks deeply, acts intentionally, and holds themselves to a higher standard. You start to feel stretched in the best way. They don't push you to be better. They just remind you you're capable of more. But here's what most people miss about Jim Rohn's quote. It's not about cutting people off. It's about choosing your center of gravity. You don't need to abandon your friends. You need to ask, who do I allow to anchor me? Because who you let close will always pull you in some direction. The question is, which one? Think of it this way. If you spend time with 5 people who are deeply curious, you'll probably stop pretending to know everything. If you spend time with 5 people who are financially reckless, you'll likely stop saving not because you changed, but because saving feels weird when no one else does. And if you spend time with 5 people who are emotionally aware, you'll slowly start labeling your own feelings more clearly just by listening to speak. You don't become a clone of your circle, but you do become fluent in the language they speak. I asked Rachel one day, Do you think you've changed because of them? She paused, then said something that stayed with me. I think I stopped growing because they weren't growing. That's it, really. Growth doesn't always die with resistance. Sometimes it just fades in environments where it's not mirrored. We mirror effort. We mirror focus. We mirror dreams. If your circle doesn't reflect the life you want, you'll start shrinking your life to fit the circle. But let's be honest, this isn't always easy. Sometimes, the 5 people you're around the most are family, or coworkers, or people you love. So what then? You don't have to leave them. You just have to add better voices to the room. Books, podcasts, mentors, online communities. Any voice that raises the ceiling instead of lowering the floor. Sometimes, it's not about escaping your environment. It's about diluting its influence until your vision gets louder than their comfort. And here's one more thing. You might be one of the 5 in someone else's life. So ask yourself, if someone spent all day around me, what would they start becoming? It's not about being perfect. But if you want better energy around you, start by being the one who carries it in. The truth is, we don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to the standard of our surroundings. And choosing your surroundings doesn't just mean choosing people. It also means choosing how you respond to them. Because sometimes, no matter how strong your circle is, life still pushes you into silence, into corners, into places where you feel alone, even when you're not. What happens then? Where do you turn? When even your best people can't carry what you're holding inside? Maybe that's when you have to stop reaching outward and start turning inward. And maybe that's when an ancient idea from Eastern philosophy becomes relevant again. It's a well-known quote from Confucius, one of the most influential thinkers in Eastern tradition. The noble person seeks it in himself. The petty person seeks it in others. When Rachel realized she had stopped growing because no one around her was growing, it wasn't just a personal observation. It was something deeper, something that touches all of us. Because even if we surround ourselves with the right people, even if we play the long-term game, there are moments in life when things still fall apart. People disappoint us. Support systems fail. And no amount of right environment can carry us through. In those moments, it's tempting to look outward. Blame the people who let us down. Blame the circumstances that held us back. Blame the world for not bending to our will. But here's the thing. Looking outward might feel satisfying, but it rarely leads anywhere. It's in times like these that an ancient idea from Eastern philosophy becomes deeply relevant. A famous quote by Confucius, one of the most influential thinkers in the East, goes, "The noble person seeks it in himself. The petty person seeks it in others." It's one of those lines that sounds simple until you sit with it long, enough to feel how hard it is to live by. Let's break it down. The noble person seeks it in himself. Not because they believe they're always wrong, but because they understand where their power actually lives. Responsibility isn't blame. It's direction. It says, I can't control everything, but I can control how I meet it. The noble person isn't noble because they're flawless. They're noble because they choose accountability over resentment. I once met a student, Michael, who had grown bitter about everything. His school didn't teach him real-world skills. His parents pressured him into a major he didn't like. His friends seemed more privileged, more connected, more free. He wasn't wrong about any of that, but he was stuck. Every complaint pulled him further from action. Because when your story starts with, "They did this to me," it usually ends with, so there's nothing I can do. We talked one afternoon. I asked him, what if none of that changes? What then? He was silent, then said quietly, I guess I'd have to start changing myself. That's when things shifted. Not magically, but intentionally. He stopped waiting for the world to be fair before he tried. He stopped needing permission to begin. He still had frustrations, but he used them as fuel, not excuses. That's what Confucius meant. The noble person doesn't pretend the world is perfect. They just stop outsourcing their power. Now let's talk about the second part. The petty person seeks it in others. Not evil people, not bad people, just people who always look for someone else to fix what's broken. We've all done it. Waiting for the apology that never comes. Waiting for the system to open a door. Waiting for someone to notice, to validate, to lift us up. But waiting is a form of giving away your life. Every time you say, I can't move forward until you hand over the pen that writes your story. That's not petty in the insulting sense. It's petty because it shrinks you, because it makes you small in your own life. What Confucius invites us to do is radical, especially today. We live in a time where pointing fingers is easy. Blame is currency. Outrage is entertainment. But real growth doesn't happen on the internet. It happens in the quiet moment when you realize, I've been angry at everyone, except the one person who can actually do something about it, me. This isn't about being self-centered. It's about being self-accountable. It's about asking, what part of this is mine to carry? What can I learn, even here? What would it look like to take responsibility, even when it's hard? That's not weakness, that's strength. Not ego, but clarity. But here's the paradox. When you begin turning inward, when you stop blaming, when you start owning, it gets lonelier before it gets lighter. Because you no longer get to be the victim. You no longer get the comfort of excuses. You start seeing yourself clearly, and that's not always pretty, but it's always powerful. Because once you stop waiting on others to choose for you, you begin choosing yourself. And when you choose yourself truly, you don't need as much permission, approval, or noise. You begin walking differently. Slower, maybe, but steadier. Because you're not walking away from the world. You're walking with yourself for the first time. So, what does that actually look like? Sometimes it looks like forgiving someone who never said sorry. Not for them, but for your freedom. Sometimes it means starting something small, not because it's safe, but because it's yours. Sometimes it just means telling the truth. I don't know where I'm going, but I want to go on my own terms. And maybe that's the real turning point. Not when you win, not when you're finally understood, but when you realize that being misunderstood isn't the worst thing. Living disconnected from yourself is. Confucius didn't promise it would be easy, but he pointed to the only direction that's ever been truly yours, inward. And if you followed this far, you're probably someone who doesn't just want success, you want alignment. A life that makes sense inside before it looks good outside. So before we close, let me leave you with one final idea. It's not a quote, it's a quiet truth. One that often goes unnoticed in the rush to fix yourself. Maybe the point isn't to be fully healed. Maybe the point is to keep showing up even when you're not. So maybe the question was never, how do I become more successful? But rather, how do I become someone I respect even in silence? You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to heal overnight. You don't even need to feel ready. You just need to keep showing up for the game that matters, for the people who stretch you, for the truth inside you. Success will come and go, But self-respect? That's what stays when no one's watching. And if you've made it this far, maybe it means you're ready to stop running someone else's race. Maybe you're ready to live on your own terms. Slow, honest, long-term. So here's my quiet invitation to you. Share in the comments. What's one thing you're choosing for yourself this year? Like this video if it spoke to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, honest, clear, human. And don't miss the next episode. We'll go even deeper. Until then, keep walking. Not perfectly, just truly. Thank you for listening. Wishing you a joyful weekend evening.